Hello and welcome back. Today I am joined by Professor Graham Smith, who is physiotherapist and the newly appointed President of the Society of Sports Therapists. So Graham, thank you very much for joining.
Andy, good morning. Good to see you again. So yeah, thanks for the invitation.
No problem. So just before we go into the normal things, so you got the new title of President. When did that happen?
2 weeks ago. So obviously the Society of Sports Therapists has been going 31 years. I've obviously been involved from the start as one of the founders, and have been basically chairman. But we now age. I was going to say age catches up. That sounds awful, isn't it? Really, but it's now time to start looking forward and for the society to go forward. So we've got a younger board of directors, and I've moved away from being the chairman. And society always had a title for president, but it was never appointed. And the guys thought it would be sort of a reflection on what I've done to basically offer me the opportunity to be president. So I'm still involved in the society, still have a major role with regards to the education side of things, and we move forward, into exciting times.
No, sounds good. Yeah, well, we'll come back to the sports therapist later on as well. But just kicking off then, so whereabouts are you from originally?
Originally, I come from a place called Brackley in Northamptonshire, which is halfway between Northampton and Oxford, and close to Silverstone Race Circuit. And they have a football team now that are now sitting at the top of the National North League. So yeah, so they're doing all right. So effectively, so I'm a Brackley boy, home of Mercedes as well.
Right. Oh, interesting. I was actually chatting with Bill Ribbons last week, so he was talking to me about the Northampton route as well. So yeah, it's got a lot of interesting ties to that area too.
Yeah. No, good area. I've been away from it a long time, and as you know, sort of, I'm up here in Glasgow, so I've been up here. Yeah, goodness me, well over 30 years. You can tell that by my accent. No, really. So it hasn't changed. Love it. Great city. It's interesting times at the moment because as we do the recording, we've got COP26 going on. So it's an interesting time to be in Glasgow.
Oh, right, interesting. Yes, I know my colleagues were up there yesterday actually seeing some Scottish Institute. And so so how is Glasgow at the moment then with that the conference that's going on?
Busy. Obviously, a lot of roads have been closed. Where we're based, where the clinic is based and the society is based, we have a beautiful outlook, which overlooks the university in Kelvin Grove Park, which obviously was the starting point last week for 2 of the marches. So effectively, we weren't in for a couple of the days, and then there was one of the VIP events was also held in the area. So it's been disruptive in certain parts of the city. In other parts of the city, you wouldn't know that the event is actually going on, really.
Right. Cool. And then go back to you then. So how did you get involved with physiotherapy?
I trained in the Royal Air Force as a physiotherapist. So basically, that was my starting point into the profession. Went in, trained as a physio, had a good career really, and thoroughly enjoyed my time in it. I always look back and think, like a lot of things, I was lucky in a lot of areas. I met some great people. I got commissioned at the time when I went in. It wasn't an all commissioned service. You went into the ranks, and then there were the opportunity to become commissioned. I became a qualified teacher of physio because, again, at those times we had when I trained, there were three schools of physio. Each of the services had their own school, accredited by the CSP. Civilians were also trained there. It then became joint services, and I was basically then sent away for 18 months to become a qualified teacher of physio, and did that at Bath, which was great. So it was Bath School of Physio, and was basically destined to stay until 55, until obviously I had an approach made at that time. Lilleshall was, the Football Association were looking to set up Lilleshall. I was approached if I would be interested in it, and yeah, as they say, the rest then became history.
So why do you think that well, for one, why did you pick physiotherapy to do at that point in the military?
Because I picked physiotherapy. I used to play rugby, and basically rugby was in the family. Rugby was in the schools I went to. So I played rugby, got injured, obviously had to go through physiotherapy. At that time, the guy who was my physio was ex-military. It was something that then started to appeal to me, because I like that. I didn't enjoy being a patient, I must admit, but I liked the thought of being the opposite side and doing that. And again, I suppose it sounds, but I don't keep saying like, and at that time, because that sounds like I'm coming back into the archives, but at the time that I trained, it was really predominantly a female profession, and effectively the schools of physio were predominantly female, and the forces, well, they were going to pay you to basically train. So it was an opportunity. You obviously had to sign up for a period of time. The opportunity, the guy Keith Davis, who was the guy who was basically my physiotherapist, he'd been ex-Air Force. We spoke about the RAF. I looked into it and decided, yeah, that's something I'd like to do, and applied for it. Didn't actually get in at the time of applying. It took a while because they didn't try. They stopped training for a while, and then it came back again, and sort of got this contact that said, are you still interested? Yeah, so I thought, yeah, and it was great. It was a great training because effectively it was a combination of you had to pass two sets of really standards. One, what the military expected, and the other one was obviously what the CSP expected. So a lot of our placements were done in NHS hospitals. A lot of my placement was done in Stoke Mandeville, in and around there. And then obviously we also then did placements at the military hospitals and the military rehab centre. So it was a good, strong training, and there were 11 of us on my course. Five service and 6 civilians.
Yeah. No, it looks incredible. Like, I've played football with a couple of people that have been in the Air Force, and like they get treated like a professional athlete, basically, it seems to me from the outside. Yeah,
I mean, I think that's it's an interesting, I suppose, when you look at it. You've got to be fit to be in the forces, and you can see the degrees of fitness you require when you look at what goes on in what you see happening around the world at the moment. So and if you consider on the rehabilitation side, effectively our role in time of peace is to prepare these people for conflict, and therefore the military hospital, service hospitals, I think, offered a great standard, and there used to be quite a few around the UK, but we don't have them now. It's integrated in through the NHS, and obviously, about the Queen Elizabeth in Birmingham, which is, which has a phenomenal military wing in it. So military medicine is. Sometimes I think it is ahead because of what it has to do and what it has to deal with. So and I think also you see examples of this during COVID when the Jubilee hospitals and the temporary the ICC temporary the hospitals that were set up in London, they were set up using the experience of what the military guys have had to do in conflict zones. So effectively utilising that. Working in a military environment, military hospital, we had NHS patients, but we also had military patients as well. And then when you go to the rehab centres, then effectively, and at that time we had Headley Court, which is obviously now moved, had Chesington, and then of course we had centres in Germany as well. So effectively, and the ones in Germany were joint service, so you weren't just dealing with RAF, you're dealing with all services. So effectively, it was preparing people to return to good standards of fitness, and from that, I think that gave me and my colleagues, a good solid grounding in physical therapy and rehabilitation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So then, in terms of that opportunity at Lilleshall, how do you think, like, why do you think they approached you to do it?
I sometimes refer to this as like sliding doors. I was stationed in Germany. I was the head of department at RAF Vegberg, which was the hospital there. I was also a physio and looked after combined services in the RAF football team. I'd been involved with the British athletes up to and in and around the Los Angeles period of the games. So, and as you know, from football, the FA Council is made up of representatives from, all of the counties and the military. So there were one or two people that were quite influential in the concept of Lilleshall being formed. Fred Street, who was obviously at Arsenal physio, Mike Varney, who was at Tottenham, Bertie Mee, who obviously is well known, was at Arsenal and within football, and also had come from a physio background besides the coaching and the management that he did. And they were concerned that if you look in the sort of in the 80s, there were a lot of professional footballers that were being lost to the game with injuries that if you were in any other industry wouldn't mean that was the end of your career. So if you were a miner, then you had the miners rehab centre at Chester Street you could go to. There was John Williams Industrial Rehab Centre at Farnham Park that you could go to. But if you were in football, and again, what you're looking at is that there weren't the qualified staff, medical staff. So anybody could be appointed as the physio. A manager would get appointed in those days, and his best mate would be appointed as assistant because he knew the dark secrets. And then you'd look at another mate who's he'd be the coach. And then Andy, look, you've had a lot of you've had a lot of injuries. You know where the treatment room is. You better be the physio. And I think it's not talking about school, but if you look at Liverpool at that point in time, Ronnie Moran at once, phenomenal coach. He was the physio at one stage. Roy Evans, phenomenal coach, manager. He was the physio. So effectively, they were there, and for me, they did. When you reflect on it, they did a brilliant job in looking after the players that were playing. But if you got a long-term injury, you were left on your own, and there was nowhere for you to go. And Fred, Bertie, me, and Mike Varney, and a lot of these guys were then going, this is wrong. So they managed to talk about the concept of this, of having a rehabilitation centre, which then the PFA thought was a good idea. And Gordon Taylor was really a great supporter on it at that time as well. The FA, obviously, with Charles Hughes at that point in time. So the concept was done. The FA were based at Lilleshall because that was where a lot of the training and the coaching courses were run. So Lilleshall then became, because of the facilities there, became a site, and so the concept was there. And then they started to look for people, and there were several people that were interviewed, but my name somehow come into the frame. I had a phone call. One day I walked into my office in Vegberg, the phone was ringing. This is why I talk about the sliding doors. Do you pick it up or you don't pick it up? So I picked it up, voice on the end, to then talking to me about this. Was I interested? If I was interested, it would be in my interest to basically apply. And they were then going to be holding interviews in Lilleshall, and they gave me a date. it was a day I was due to be an orderly officer, because that went with the job kind of stuff, and so it was like, do I? Anyway, I changed it and went across, and basically on the feedback that I had afterwards, because they offered me the job before I even left Lilleshall, was because I'd been running a rehab centre, and because I didn't come from a purely football background, I wasn't going to be running it like a football club. It was going to be run like a rehabilitation centre, and questions that you were asking about, like on the discipline side of things, I was having to deal with squaddies on a day-to-day basis. Yes, so and you know yourself, footballers can be naughty boys that never grow up. So sometimes it's so those were the kind of discussions, and then I had the call, sort of before I left, was I interested? And then of course it was the decisions had to be made, because I had a good career. I was going to be in the Air Force until the age of 55. So I flew back to Germany and obviously had discussions and spoke to some of my bosses in the Air Force, and the Air Force were phenomenal in that they allowed me to go and do it. So it was, because for me it was I suppose it was an exciting opportunity to do something that had never been done before, although it had been done before because we were doing it every day, if you know what I mean. And I suppose, and the other thing was that sometimes you need the challenges, really, and I just felt that this would be an interesting challenge to take on.
No, it sounds incredible, and you can really see why your experience from the military was actually going to be perfect for them as sort of outsider, so to speak, but also have the experience in setting that up. So what was it like then when you go in on your first day there? Like, is that an overwhelming task, or had you been sort of planning what you wanted to implement?
When the decision was made, and I knew that I was going, and effectively the date, it was going to open on the 1st of September. So I knew that I'd be leaving the Air Force sort of on the 31st of August, and had leave to take. I then spoke to a lot of my friends and colleagues that worked in the rehab centres within the forces, and my question to them was, if you could change anything, what would you change? So what would be the ideal working environment to work in? And this might be something we might come back to develop when you look at it in modern day, especially within football. If you looked at like the rehab centres, you had a lot of remedial gymnasts, and I'm not sure whether you're familiar with the remedial gymnasts. So remedial gymnasts were guys who had a physical education background, who basically then did a course, which then gave them the skills to work with people who had injuries and disability. And now you still have remedial instructors that within, and they took responsibilities. So if you go into a rehab centre, you're allocated depending on your injury and your severity. So you would go in at early knees, into knees, late knees, early backs, early spines, into spines, late spines, pre-discharge. And the remedial gymnast was the king of that gym. So you would report there every morning, and that your whole day is going to be there, except when you would leave to come to physio, or you would then go off to an OT, or you go to sort of the other departments. When you talk to the physios and being a physio, so if you were a patient and you would come into the physio department, you'd be allocated with me for maybe 30 minutes twice a day. I would only see you in the physio department. I wouldn't see you when you're in the gyms doing the exercises. So I didn't really, I could advise you and do things, but I didn't know what you were doing. And when you spoke to the RGs, they wanted to have the control of you, but when you went off, they had no control. So they didn't know what the physios were doing, and they didn't know what the OTs were doing. So and everybody worked to clearly defined objectives, but this was the pattern. So when we spoke about it, said, right, what we do is that effectively you, Andy, you're going to be responsible for a group. So, and that's your responsibility for the week. So when they come in, you're going to do the assessments, you're going to do the program, you're going to do the individual treatments, you're going to do the fitness work, you're going to do the hydrotherapy, you're going to do the remedial games. They are your group. You've got them all the time. That's it. So effectively, you've got total control and responsibility. So that was how we planned it. Staff-wise, what the FA had obviously appointed staff. And you may know, there's a guy, Phil Newton, great physiotherapist, came from the NHS, really good at manual therapy, got love Phil, never worked in a rehab and exercise environment. There's another guy there called Jim Langer, who was also looking after the School of Excellence. So we were the three that started off. Our very first week, we had 3 patients, 2 international gymnasts and 1 professional footballer, who had a severe repetitive calf injury, and his club decided it'd be a good idea to send him up to spend some time with us. Phil's wife, Pauline, is a physiotherapist, and at the end of the week when he went home, he said to me, he'd gone home and said to Pauline, he was knackered. He said, I'm absolutely knackered. And she said, well, why? You've only had 3 patients. You know, you've just gone from an environment where you've been seeing 30 patients a day. You know, why are you tired? He said, because they never go away. He said, they're with you all the time. He says, and obviously, effectively, you know, it's that, you know, you do the individual treatments. Okay, what's next? Well, we're going in the gym. We're going to do some circuits, some work. Okay, finish that. What's next? We're going down the pool. Okay, what's next? What's next? What's next? So all the time, and it was getting into that kind of that kind of thought process and mentality. And as we developed, obviously, you know, more and more people came, and we needed more staff. And I know you've done an interview with Grant Downey. You know, Grant came and spent some time with us as an elective to start off with, and then came down and sort of applied for one of the jobs, and you know, and Grant came in and spent time, and it was very, you know, I think sometimes he may reflect and say, you know, I think I was quite a hard boss, because, you know, I didn't want us to get into just routines. So you did the same thing every day, because some of these guys are going to be with you for a while. You know, they had fairly severe long-term injuries, and they would be, you know, they'd be with us for a couple of weeks and go back to the club for a week and then come back. You know, and yes, as you know, it's very easy for patients to get bored. You know, so we tried to make sure, but there's only so many ways you can bend a knee and straighten the knee. But it's what else you do around it to have that motivation, and also you have players coming in from various clubs who then realise that, you know, the interaction between them was good because they weren't on their own. So that's in a way how we built it up, and then obviously other things started to develop, human performance and the education side alongside it as well. So it was good. It was to say it was a fun time. It was hard work, and sorry, we had a lot of support from we had a tremendous amount of support from Bobby Robson, who at the time was obviously the England boss, and that was good. And within, I think, with the first 18 months, we'd had players from at least 80 of the 92 English Premier League or English football clubs. Obviously, we had quite strong links up with Scotland as well. So, you know, Rangers, Aberdeen, Hearts, Hibs were all supportive, and we were also getting players that were coming in from internet. So other countries were sending them in as well. So I think it was when they went back, they were fit, and they were fit because they worked hard. And I'm not sure whether you've been to Lilleshall, but you know, it's 2 miles from the main gate to the main buildings. Yeah, so you're either going to walk it, run it, or cycle it several times during a week. You know, it makes it makes you fit, but all the time, you make sure that you're meeting the objectives that you meet, because the aim is, you want these people to progress, and that when they go back, they are fit to go back to unrestricted activities. And that was the military concept. You don't send somebody back into a unit who basically isn't fit to do everything they expect when he goes back. And that was the concept. When you left us, you were fit to return to unrestricted activities. So you would have been through a pre-discharge week, which would have included 3 full coaching sessions built into on a daily basis, built into the program of other things that you're having to do as well. So and could you then, after a hard Tuesday, get up the next day and repeat it the next day? And could you repeat it the next day? And if you could go back and you could repeat everything that was required, and you could do that, then we could then hand on heart say, yes, you're fit to return to unrestricted training, unrestricted activities. And I think that was what that clubs started to appreciate. That's very much, that was a military concept. We're going to send you back fit to do everything, because when you go back to a unit after you've been away, then their expectations on you are going to be that you can do everything. Otherwise, why have you come back?
Yeah, no, it makes sense totally. And then you mentioned that Roy Robson was supportive. So in what way was that?
Obviously, when we opened, he was obviously there for the opening ceremony, and sort of would often talk about it in interviews if players were there. Probably the most supportive area was that players were going back fit, but it was very much, in a way, the subjectivity. And at the time, and again, you'll know the name, John Brewer, who was a fairly eminent sport exercise scientist, was at Loughborough, and he was doing some work with the School of Excellence. So the School of Excellence was going on at the same time. This was where the cream of English boys between the age of sort of 14 and 16 would come and spend the 2 years working with the top coaches, and the aim was that these would be the guys that would eventually win the World Cup for us, kind of stuff. And I had conversations with John about, we need to do objective measurements on these guys, and effectively, so before they go back, let's get some baselines on it. So let's have a look at them. Let's have a look at the measurements. Let's look at the fitness, and do some objective testing, isokinetic, aerobic, anaerobic testing, so that we've got a kind of baseline that we could start to work with. On one of the sessions that we were doing, and Bob Robson was there, and obviously came in and started to ask questions about, sort of what you're doing. So we were obviously explaining to him what we're doing, to which he went, "We should get the England boys tested." Right. So, okay. So it was then set up that the England squad would then come and be tested. And so all of a sudden you're looking at it and go that effectively the first squad virtually that was tested was the England team. So they came and spent a day with us, and we put them through the battery of tests, and then obviously took that information back. So, and again, it was to give an idea of baselines, and also to start to look at were there any indicators that you could see of potential injuries coming into it. Within that squad, of course, there were several players who were playing up here in Glasgow, because at that time, so they'd obviously gone back to their manager and spoke about what was going on. So the next squad that was effectively tested was the Rangers squad, Glasgow Rangers. And then Graham Taylor was at Villa at the time, and then he brought. So and then it was obviously what we really need to have that kind of centre. So that's how the human performance department really started at Lilleshall, and obviously John then got employed full time, and that became a very, very significant part of the process. And as you know, the sport and exercise side of things has become quite important. And it was really to get this concept across within football at that time, that effectively, if you've got these baseline measurements, then it's easy to determine whether a person is fit to return, because you know where they are. You know where they are at the start of the season, and you can see the way that that's developed and gone through. And I suppose in a way, the other thing that obviously came out of it is that we would have managers and coaches coming down to see what magic equipment we had. Well, we didn't have magic equipment. We had space. We had bicycles. We did have an isokinetic machine, which was a challenge to get the money to buy, because the concept was you could get a lot of sandbags for that. But yeah, okay. But if you're going to be a centre of excellence, so that was how we sold it. We had benches, we had medicine balls, and we had work. So there wasn't lots of this high tech equipment. It was basically we had all this area, and we had football pitches. And we also, when the golfers came, we had a golf course that we could use. And it was also, the National Gymnastics Centre, and it was also a cricket centre. So we had those facilities. When the cricketers came, we could use the nets, and we could take them down to the nets. Or if we felt like having a bit of fun with them, we could throw them into the gymnastic pit and make them do exercises in that. So, that was the equipment that we had, which was appropriate to what they were going to do.
And how was the integration between those different sets of athletes then? But how did they all mix?
Yeah, very, very well. Yeah. We also used to have quite a lot of jockeys that came. And again, that was one of those, I suppose, things that happened that effectively, I had a telephone call one day from a guy called Jeffrey Summers, who had just set up the Injured Jockeys Fund, to say that there was nowhere for jockeys to go at that time, and that they would it be possible to come up and talk about jockeys coming up and spending time with us for their if they needed rehabilitation. So he came up with a colleague who was Peter Scoodler, and we then started to get jockeys, and obviously predominantly footballers and jockeys are in the room. Oh wow, they're looking. So there was always the banter between the two. Whenever we had cricketers in, every afternoon finishes with remedial games, and one of the last things that happens on a Friday before they go home is sit down volleyball becomes a very big part of rehab, regardless of what level of fitness you are. And the very last thing they would do on a Friday, we'd have one game of sit down volleyball, 15 points. If you were on the winning team, then you went upstairs, got changed, you sort of see the doc, but you would go home. If you're on the losing team, if you could run, then you had to run to the main gates and back. If you couldn't run but you could cycle, then you had to do the 6-mile cycle. Right? If you couldn't do that, then you were on the isokinetic machine. So there were fairly harsh penalties for losing. So all through the week, they would be looking to see new patients come in, what they're like. Everybody would try and avoid jockeys because for some reason they're not very good with their hands coordination, which is quite comical. Cricketers, yeah, so the integration would be built up because they were having to share common things together, and those included remedial games, they included the hydro sessions, and when the cricketers were in, and there's a few fairly eminent international cricketers, we always played sit down cricket because they were rubbish at it, and as you know, I think sometimes the sport you end up playing depends on where you come from. and what you see is a lot of very talented, a lot of very good ball players have the hand-eye coordination that they could play rugby, or they could play football. They could, and they become good golfers, And when a couple of the golfers would come in, I mean, yeah, they all wanted to play golf with them, and so there was a common thing that they all loved the things that they did, but they all loved, if you were a golfer and you went in there, you're going to be a football fan, aren't you? So all of a sudden you go in there and there's players probably from the club, and it was almost like, goodness gracious, look at, that's so and so, and then at the other end, one of the footballers would look at a golfer and go, that's so and so, isn't it? Oh my God! So you had this kind of feeling, and they would get to know each other, and I know there were a lot of fairly good friendships that were built up because they were sharing a common thing, which is, they were all injured and going through that recovery bit, and that's why those rehab centres were, and we don't see enough of it, and and I don't know if when you worked NHS, if you worked in gyms where you had group sessions, bring a group of patients into a gym, and they'll work and they'll integrate, and they'll do much more, and they'll do much more of what they're supposed to do when they're within a group than they will if they're individual. And if they know they're coming back a week later, they'll do their exercises, because when they come back a week later, they don't want to be the one that's not going to be allowed to stay there because they've not improved. So, and you see that, I did my teacher training at Bath, obviously with the Royal Mineral Hospital for rheumatic diseases. We used to do a lot of work with the patients with ankylosing spondylitis, and they would come in every 6 months for a week, exercise and rehabilitation, and they were put into groups. They would work hard in those 6 months because they didn't want to come back 6 months later and have been basically relegated to another group. One, because that doesn't feel good, and two, because the stick they get from the ones they've left behind is unbelievable. So that type of integration and concept would go on, and I think that's why. So the sports guys, yeah, they got on well, yeah.
Now, it sounds great fun. So who were the particular people who were the best at sit-down volleyball then?
Probably the Wimbledon Crazy Gang boys, because they were vocal as well. We had quite a lot of Liverpool players that were there that used to come in, and they weren't too bad. There was one player who played for Everton, and he was a winger, and he was predominantly dominant left-handed. He could not do anything with his right hand or with his right foot, and he was probably one of the weakest because they would identify always shoot to the left. So they very soon found out the weaknesses. But the Friday lunchtime game is a fairly hard game to referee. Yeah, so you had to be quite strong, and we did have one or two, students or young physios, and that would come and want to spend a couple of weeks with us, and yeah, they became quite quivering wrecks when they were told they were doing that game on it. So, or that they had to do warm-ups as well. Yeah, so yeah.
So I can certainly imagine if you're coming up against the Crazy Gang that, yeah, you might have a few concerns about making bad decisions or any decision.
Oh yeah.
I can probably guess who that left-footed player was as well, but I won't mention his name.
I know, that's why I'm being very, very cautious on that. Yeah. But
I'm an Everton fan, so yeah, he was a great player anyway. But in terms of that then, so did you actually see any of those? Because when I was growing up, you'd know about Lilleshall, like all of the best players would go and play at Lilleshall. Did you look after those, the junior players as well then?
Yes. Yeah. So so there was one member of staff that was allocated to them, and then obviously if they had injuries or they had problems, then they came through us. Yes, and we made sure that they were okay, and we monitored them as much as we could, and that was quite an interesting concept as well, because you effectively you had this group of young lads that were there, and they were, the aim was that they'd gone through a really intense selection process to get there, and they were working with with the top coaches at that time. So they would go to school and they would come back. They'd have the training sessions, and they played one game. They played a competitive game a week at the weekends, and that was always interesting with the coaches about was that game a game that they had to win, or was it a game to put in systems that they'd learned, so to learn how to change it, and those were sort of discussions that went on. Plus, you also had the associated problems of that, they were growing, these, and I think we learned quite a lot on that, with regards to, effectively you have them for their first year, they've been selected, you have them for the first year, it's quite an intense year. They would go home during the summer for a few weeks to come back. You didn't recognise them when they come back, because all of a sudden they've gone through growth spurts because they're not doing the high intensity training. Coaches used to go, they'd tear their hair out because, all of a sudden for this 1 year you've worked with this young, small, squat, really well coordinated athlete, and then he's come back looking like Pinocchio, just had the strings cut off, no coordination. So we then had to look at, and do quite a lot of work on really looking at growth spurts, and that started to make sure that we developed the interest, sort of when you started to look at things like Osgood-Schlatter's and Sever's disease, that effectively you're looking at the softening of a bone that's related to the growth spurt. So when's that going to occur? It doesn't necessarily occur when they're doing the high intensity training. So the risk time is if they're injured or there's a period of rest, like the holiday, and you see that, you see that in everyday life now, where, at the end of the school year, mothers are very clever and they go out and they buy the school kit and say, we'll get this now. And it's so if we buy this now, then effectively we haven't got to rush about the week before you go back to school. Obviously, you then have the school holidays, and then they try the kit on the day before you go back to school, and it doesn't fit. So poor kids get shouted at because effectively the sleeves are up here. And you go, that's because they've gone through growth spurts. So there were lots of things, and because of the gymnastics as well, and because that was the training. So we were dealing with a lot of fairly elite adolescent athletes, and that required a kind of different mentality as well, to make sure, these weren't mini adults that you did everything that you would do with an adult. So we went into education sessions with the boys at the schools, so that if they started to feel the twinges that might be related to something like Osgood-Schlatter's or that they didn't try to play through it, they highlighted it, but it wouldn't mean that they would lose a lot of training. We would just modify their activities to allow that process to harden off. So having the boys there was also quite an interesting exercise, and it was, I suppose, there was controversy around it. Was it good to have people in there for that period of time? Sometimes the clubs didn't want the best young players to go away and be out of their sight and control. So, but it did mean that those players, those young lads, that they were in a controlled environment. Whereas if they were at home, they'd have been playing for the school, their club, and maybe overplaying. So it's and I think the FA and youth football has learnt a lot from those days and has developed on it. So, was it a catalyst? I think it was something that initiated discussions. And I think when you look at Lilleshall and obviously there's St George's Park now. When you look at the concept of Lilleshall, and you now go to the big clubs, most of they've got their own Lilleshall. they now have the big rehab centre, so it's not so effectively, they've got all the staff, they've got the medical team, they've got the sport and exercise scientists, they've got the physios, they've got the sports therapists and rehab guys. So because they realise that you have to basically provide that kind of support, science support, and long-term wise, hopefully it will have benefits on on the longevity, that in 30 years time you won't see players that retire from today like players that retired from 30 years ago, that sometimes you see walking down the stairs and they've had the knee replacements, they've had the hip replacements, and because of going back to, they played, they probably didn't get the medical and science support that they have now, and the game's changed, and lots of things have changed. So, but I think it did form a catalyst to make people go back and think about, well, should we be providing these kind of things?
Yeah, you must have seen some incredible players coming through, not only from the professional ranks, but from the juniors as well, because quite a few iconic players who came through the Lilleshall side. So in terms of leaving Lilleshall, and how did that come to happen?
I suppose the blunt answer is I was given an offer I couldn't refuse. Sort of as referred to earlier on, obviously at the time, the Rangers team, we had a lot of integration with Glasgow Rangers. All the players came down. They obviously at that time, you had Chris Woods, Terry Butcher, Gary Stephen, Trevor Stephen, Ray Wilkins, Spackman. So there were a lot of English players that were playing up, and effectively they would come down, and obviously Ian Durant, Alison McCoyston, a lot of these players came down, and they had treatment, had the rehabilitation, and had discussions with the manager at the time, who was obviously Graham Souness, and there was a plan in a way to put together a similar rehab centre within the Ibrox area, and we spoke about it, and would you like to come and do it? And now I'm quite happy right here. Would you really like to come and do it? But I'm quite happy here. If you come and do it, well, this is, I'm being flippant here. If you come and do it, we'll pay you this much. But that wasn't actually but it was an opportunity. It was an opportunity to come up into what was a really big club, and the aim was that we would look at developing, a rehab centre that would be open, accessible to players, and it would be accessible to the public, and it would move. It didn't happen because there were changes in policies and everything else. But those were the discussions, and I would also say that I came up to be the English translator at the time. So, and it was an exciting time, because at that time, again, I don't use that phrase at that time again, but that was, Graham had gone in there. He completely changed the way Scottish football was because of the English ban in Europe. His first signing was Terry Butcher. So you now got the England captain, and then other players would come up, and it became a phenomenal team. And you mentioned being Everton. Everton's a big club, and we talk about big clubs. We don't talk about the big club. What happens there? It's the physical. Everton has supporters globally who every week will be wanting to know how their club is done. And Glasgow Rangers and the other team up here, they're exactly the same. It's a phenomenally big. And I think for me the job wasn't difficult, because effectively it was the clinical side, and the rehab side was the bread and butter. But it's when you take on board the expectations of everybody, and the expectations of of the community and the fans and everything, and you suddenly realise those, and you see players who do play at the highest level and train hard, and how how they have to deal with it as well. So some of those aspects of it, I think I always look back and for me, I learned a hell of a lot on that aspect of professional football and professional sport. You know, it's those expectations really.
And what was it like? So I guess Souness was he player manager when he went in? What was it like working with Souness? Because he was definitely a character, certainly in his playing days. He was a strong character, physically as well.
I think if you watch Sky Sport and you watch him as a pundit and everything else, you can see that he knows his own mind, and he's a very clever man. And from the times that I met him when he came down to Lilleshall and times working with him, Graham is. I have the highest admiration for him, and I was. He said to me one day, and this shows you going back. I don't spend £2.5 million on a player and then bring him in and try and teach him to play football because I wouldn't spend that money. I'm not going to employ you and ask you to do a job and then tell you how to do the job. You tell me if, and we had quite a clearly defined criteria. If that everybody knew, if a player was unable to do unrestricted training on the day before a match, they were not eligible for selection. That was it. And that was part of the discussions about me going up there as well. I wasn't going to be doing the silly little fitness test on the morning of the game, which are not real fitness. If they weren't able to go into unrestricted training on the day before a game, they were not going to be considered for selection. And everybody knew that. The players knew that. The managing coaches knew that. and I think coaches appreciate that because then they know what they're working with. Now you can say, sometimes you want that, the enigma. And Andy Roxburgh often used to talk about the enigma. David Cooper was the enigma for 85 minutes, 86 minutes. It does nothing, and then 2-3 minutes of brilliance could be the difference between winning and losing. But that enigma, can you depend on that enigma at every single game that you're going to be playing throughout the season? And coaches want to prepare, as you know, they want to prepare teams, and they want to make sure everything is in place. So therefore, if you've got that set criteria, then everybody knows where they are. And sometimes you'd have to explain why you were doing things and where they fitted in within the football concept and mentality. But so you could have those discussions. But if you were logical and you then could justify what you're doing, then Graham's that kind of guy. Right? Okay. And working with him for me was an honour. It was a pleasure. And and you've asked the question. Oh God, what was it like working for him? The man was and is a consummate professional.
Yeah. Well, that's it. I mean, again, that was one of the most successful periods in Rangers history. So, what was it like being a part of that?
Yeah, enjoyable. Enjoyable. I suppose it sounds terrible. It was a job, and that does sound. That really does sound terrible. I came from a rugby background, and loved rugby. Rugby was my first love. As a physio, looking after Marlow and rugby clubs and like that. That was my first love. The football thing just happened because I was in the Air Force. I got posted into Germany, and a squadron leader came up to me one day and said, "I understand you look after sports teams. Yeah, I'd like you to look after the RAF football team." Actually, sir, I don't do football. I do rugby. To which he then said, "Actually, that wasn't a request," kind of stuff. And so I fell into soccer. I'd been dealing with athletes, been doing gymnasts, and obviously then got into the soccer and onto the football. So if I say it was a job, and I'll always say, if you're going to employ a medic, be that a physiotherapist, a sports therapist, a doctor, don't employ a fan. Right. So if you tell me that you're an Everton fan, then I don't want you working at Everton. Yeah, because your perspective is going to be different. And in a way, you know, Rangers was a phenomenal, and I still have a great soft spot for them, as you can imagine. But it was a job, and by being a job, you know, you then make objective decisions, not subjective. Being a part of the club for Old Firm games and that is, you know, anybody has the opportunity to do that. It is something that you have to experience. Yeah, just to be there, and then you learn how physical noise is. You know, that effectively that you know 70,000 people that are basically all in unison. It's a physical noise, and you feel it. And then you have the added difficulties that when the player gets injured, you can't hear what they're saying. So you know, so those elements. But no, it was an enjoyable. It was enjoyable, but it was a good job.
Yeah. Now, I mean, I've not made it to an Old Firm game yet, but it's definitely on my bucket list to get and do. So in terms of Rangers then, so when you were leaving there, what prompted you to leave Rangers?
I think it was an element that we weren't going to do the rehab centre. Basically, then it was going to be sort of doing football, kind of as the football and other things, other opportunities. Because even at the time that I was at Rangers, I was still doing lecturing. I was still, you know, being asked to go and do conferences and everything. So it came to the point where effectively it was probably the right time to move away, other than being stuck, because we weren't going to do what I'd originally gone up to do, which was to set up a rehab centre within it. So being part of it was great, but it was then stage of saying, right, this is probably the time for us to move away, because there were other things that I really wanted to do and be a part of.
And then in terms of the sports therapy side of things, how did that originate, and how did you get involved?
It all started at Lilleshall. So because of being a qualified teacher of physio, one of the other things that I was asked to do was to look at the medical training. So at that time there was the FA certificate in the treatment of injuries that a guy called Paddy Armour was running, and to look at kind of medical education within football. And going back to the point that effectively anybody could, you didn't need any qualifications to be appointed as the club physio. So therefore there was a need to do it. So basically they asked me if I would, as part of my role and on education, would I look at kind of developing a course and a program. And what we did, and with a couple of colleagues of mine who were still in the forces, who were also teachers of physio, we basically then contacted all the clubs at that time and to their physio and asked them what the job was. What did they do? Tell us what you need to do. And from that, we built sort of a job description, and from that, an aims and objectives of the course. So we then redesigned the FA diploma in the treatment management of injuries, which then became the minimum qualification. So anybody that was going to be appointed from the 89-90 season as a minimum had to have that qualification. So we wanted to start to set minimum standards of qualifications to be the person who ran on the pitch and was the club physio. And then what it also developed, which is you'll find ironic, was that we also then got from the start of the 1991 season, any new appointment to a club had to be a chartered physio. So it's so when all the sports therapists and everybody keep going about why does it have to be why was that there and that for so long. Sorry guys, the person who was instrumental in putting it in was me, because at that time that was built upon the physios of that generation, which were the Fred Streets, the Mike Varneys, me, and a lot of people that were working in football that had come from that kind of military background. So by putting those requirements in, it meant that obviously clubs had to send people. So we got a lot of people coming to Lilleshall to do the management and treatment of injury course, and I suppose what I learned very quickly, and in a way, and as a physio, you probably understand, sometimes there's a lot of prejudice about, the therapists and sports therapists, and at that time, there was a lot of professionals. These guys don't know that, what qualifications have they got, but you suddenly realise that, these guys that were looking after injuries, they knew how to deal with the injuries. They knew first aid, and they knew how to get you fit to go back and play football, because that's what they did. That was their job. So all of a sudden, what we learned was that these guys knew. So obviously they would then come through the course, and we would then we would then start to hone them up and with the rehab and you can imagine sometimes doing physiology. We used to have 3 levels of physiology, which was physiology, the Idiot's Guide to Physiology, and the Idiot's Guide to Physiology, and then start, are you going to talk English or dog and mouse language? Is to get, and we would build up, and it was over 2 years. But what I suddenly found was that these guys were then saying to me when they did it, so what's next? What can we do next? And we then realised sort of that, the physios, they got their professional body, CSP, medics got their professional body, but there was nothing for this. So what I did was basically, I wrote to all the guys that had been through the course and said to them, look, obviously we've been through this, and there's what would be your thoughts if we set up an organisation specifically for you? And the response was phenomenal. So the first 100 members of the society all came from professional football. And obviously then once the society was formed, and we had the professional standards, because at the time I was also an elected member of the CSP Council. So I was actually on CSP Council at the time. And I'd also spoke to the CSP and said this is what we were doing, and did they want to be involved in it and support it? But they didn't at the time. But they knew that that's what I was doing, and the aim was really to improve standards of medical education and player care. Once the society was formed, then the next thing, to give it status and credibility, and knew that we then had to develop a good education program, and that the best way to do that would be then, so one thing was to get recognition and regulation, and the other thing was then to get education. So the aim then was to get a graduate qualification. And I spoke to a couple of universities, and we laid out the sort of the concept to it. And then University of North London basically said, yeah, let's we'd like to go with it. And it really was a case of the conversation was, what do your sports scientists do when they graduate? Okay, so imagine now if you took somebody with good sport and exercise science knowledge and you put into them rehabilitation and medical skills, or you took somebody with rehab and medical skills and you put good sport and exercise science into it, then you're going to have basically a practitioner that we desperately need in British sport, because physiotherapy was moving away from the what we did, which was the conflict stuff and the rehab stuff. It was becoming much more of a clinical profession. but it didn't take away that somebody's got to pick the people up when they get injured, and somebody's got to get them back to the standard where, go back to that rehab concept of unrestricted training. So, so the first degree started in 1996 at the University of North London, and as of today, the society basically has collaborative links with 32 higher education institutions and accredits 38 programs. And now, and obviously it is, it is seen as a good, it's a good thing to go in. You can see now much more, graduate sports therapists working in professional sport become much more recognised. But it has been that battle, but it wasn't done to, in conflict to my profession. It was done to basically to complement. And one of the key things is that no institution can run the degree if they don't have sport and exercise science within their portfolio, because effectively, one of my mantras is, how can you do exercise if you don't understand sport and exercise science? That becomes such an integral part of your knowledge base, and we don't have that within in physiotherapy, which is why, and I'm sure you've come across them. When you get the guys that may have done, their first degree was in sport and exercise science, and they then do the MSc fast track physio, they become good practitioners because they've got that sport and exercise science background. And that's always been a key thing of it, and it's always done. So then as the society developed, more and more people, other people came in. So, but its base was from these guys that came to Lilleshall, who, you looked at it and you go, on a day-to-day basis, they were getting, go back to the Liverpool thing. Liverpool was at the height of its success, and their players went to see Paul Chadwick, who was a private physio part-time, go and see Paul. But the rest was being done by, Roy Evans, Ronnie Moran, Bob Paisley was even the physio at one stage. Yes. So they knew how to get people fit, but it was the long-term interest, and that's what we wanted to make sure and give, I suppose, give them a status, and also give them, this professional accountability as well, and that, that became an important part of it. So it's that's really how very quickly how the society started and developed.
No, it's incredible. I mean, in my years, so it's nearly 10 years old at Physiquip, we've employed, I think, 5 or 6 sports therapists. So we've already got 2, both happen to be from Leeds, now Beckett. And they've been brilliant for us. Like, they're really, really good. Like, some of them are, well, they're all, both of them, our current ones are educating the England national team. We're in Premier League teams regularly, updating them on our technology. So they've been excellent from us, and I think, like, we've found, as very good rounded characters as well. So they're really, really good. So yeah, we've had great benefit. So Mark Leather referred me when he was at Ed Shield, referred me several people that were both great, and then we've just come across the other ones happen to be from Leeds. But so it's been a very helpful one and valuable one for me personally in that as a course. So that's really good.
Thanks for that. No, I think what you said, Andy, is right. That it's that well-rounded. As a professional body, we are. It's not an easy process to get the degree accredited, and we do moderate. So effectively, we will pick topics, and we will go in and moderate the exams, not so to make sure that that standards are being maintained across the board, and that, I think that becomes important. Sort of the example I use is, say, what you have to imagine is we've got 32 factories building Mini Coopers, and effectively, when the Mini Cooper rolls off the production line, it doesn't matter what colour it is, it doesn't matter if it's leather or but the core model has got to be the same. because that's the model we're selling, and we don't want to be going off and selling you the Mini Cooper, and then you buy a Mini Cooper, and then Robin Reliant turns up. So it's important. So and that you know what they're about, their boundaries and their scope are. So effectively, and we say that it's that sport and exercise science bit. Be for I talk to the students. You've got to be strong and be proud of that, because that's why you do it. That's why you do it. So, because you've got to be the one that's out on the pitch. You've got to be the one that's outside. So when it's pouring with rain and everything else, and people want to stay and doing the clinical stuff, well, actually, football and rugby takes place in the rain. So sometimes you've got to go out there, and that's your place of work. So get out there and do it, kind of stuff. And sometimes it's that realism. And maybe in other professions we have lost it. And always look at, do the people that are teaching you, are they still doing it? When you trained and you looked at, I think as a teacher or a lecturer, you want to inspire the students to be like you. And if you're not doing it, and you haven't been doing it for a while, it soon comes across. And I think, and you mentioned Mark Leather, and I always say, like, you look at Edge Hill, and you look at Mark, and you look at Steve, and you go, and there's a phenomenal number of years of football experience there, and to be to have that knowledge and have the opportunity to tap into it, and I know they're at UCLan now. But you look at other staff that are at Edge Hill as well, who's come from a lot of time. If you look at Hertfordshire, Joel Harris, who's senior lecturer there, he's currently away with the England team because he works with the England team. He's part of Gareth Southgate's backup, but in 2 weeks' time he'll be there lecturing the students. He spent 10 years at Arsenal, so effectively somebody, it's not somebody when I was with, actually, this week, he's at St George's Park as part of that medical team, and I think that becomes important. I was trying to say that just with some of the universities when they're employing staff, don't just look for the ones with the PhDs. Look for the ones with practical experience, because you can't buy that. You can help somebody develop the doctorate and the PhD, but you can't buy 16, 17 years of working in a professional football club. And that's what the students who want to listen to, because 80% of their time is going to be with the students. Only a small percentage of the time is going to be on research. So, and I think when you look at some of the universities, and I think, you've got posh places and you've got inner city places. If students come from an inner city background, they're tough. You need to be tough to work in sport, because people shout at you. And which is why it goes back to, that's why if you come from a military background, that you come from a tough background. And you have to be sharp, because if they see any weakness in you, they'll expose it. So if you've come from that type of background, sometimes you can cope with it. And you look at some of the best practitioners, if you look back over the years and you go, now I know why. And I think that becomes an important part of it as well.
Now that feeds nicely into what probably the last question is, in terms of the people that have had the biggest impact on you. So who's been influential in your career and helped you develop those things?
Do you know, I knew you were going to ask me that. And actually, that came to my mind in the shower this morning. It's not that I was thinking of you in the shower. I promise. It was that. Okay. A guy called Don Gatherer. Don is a physiotherapist. That still is. It sounds terrible, and is still very much involved. When I qualified, in the Air Force, and I was posted to the first hospital. Don was the sergeant physio in charge of the gym, and he was going to be my mentor. At the time, he was also a physiotherapist to the England rugby team. He'd also worked with the British athletic squad. He's well known now because he's the one that's developed a lot of the main strength and exercises for Formula One and for the rugby guys, even now. So he still does a lot of work with the international squads. And on the first day I was working with him, he said, "I'll give you one bit of advice. Stay on top of your anatomy. Never lose your anatomy. Because if you lose your anatomy, then you lose the answers to every problem that patients bring with you." And then working with him, he basically got me involved. He played rugby for Marlow, and said they needed somebody to look after them. Said to me, "Look, why don't you come and do it? I know you can't play anymore, but why don't you come and do it?" To which, I was slightly reluctant, but he could say, "Hang on a second, you just qualified as physio, you've got collar dogs on there, says you're a medic." He said, "Anything else we can deal with." So Don got me involved in rugby, got me involved in athletics. So very much instrumental. So he always will say about Don. The second person was a lady called Nabuku Shindu. Nabuku was a Japanese physiotherapist who basically worked at Stoke Mandeville, and she was one of the first qualified physios from Japan, and worked with spinal injuries. She was, if she touched 5 feet, that was about her height. But what she could do with 6 and 7 foot tetraplegics and quadriplegics was unbelievable. And I think it was her work ethic of anything is possible. So these are not problems, they're challenges. So when you start to look at somebody who's basically quadriplegic, and you've now got to get them to do certain things, these are not problems, they're challenges. How are you going to help this? So and I spent a lot of time with her, both as a student and as a recently qualified physiotherapist. And then probably the third person is a guy called Mike Potter. Mike was a warrant officer, remedial gymnast, who basically, when we were students, he was responsible for teaching us exercise and rehab. For the first 6 months, he took us in the gym and we played games. And then the second 6 months, he took us in and he started to give us exercises specific to various joints. And then the third 6 months, he started then to put them into conditions. But when you went on to an orthopedic ward round with him, and these were the days we had to wear white coats, right? He would, before the first ward round I did, he said to me, "You've got to take measure." "I can't take measure." "String?" "What?" So he gave us some string. "Screwdriver?" "What?" "Screwdriver." Okay. And there was a whole load of different things. And the reason was that when you go, again, these were the days that patients, if they broke the leg, they were on traction. So you go around the ward rounds, the consultant there, he wanted to adjust the traction, turned to charge nurse. "Right, I need a screwdriver." Charge nurse, Mick will pull out the pocket there. "Right, thanks, sir. Thanks, sir." It was his attention to detail and his planning, and always remember that for me that his rehab sessions, his exercise sessions were planned meticulously. They looked like he just made them up as he was going along, but he knew exactly what he was going to do. And he knew that the moment he walked onto a ward, and he had this little magic ball that he would stand in the door of the ward, and these are obviously Nightingale wards, and he would throw the ball halfway down the ward, the ball would bounce back, and he would then walk on the ward. And as he walked on the ward, every patient was doing their exercises. So, right, and just to do just little things that he did that I did take and took through, sort of through my career. And I know, if people are watching this that have been patients or been physios or staff with me, they go, "That's where the bugger got it from." But I think those three people, and I know that's going back a long time, but they set the foundation. there've been lots of other people that have been through the journey, you know, on the journey that I've gone through. But I think, you know, when I look at it in my early formative days of my career, those three people set the foundations, which I hope I've built, you know, professionally and personally on.
No, it's great. It's great to hear those specific tales and things that really resonate, because it's funny, isn't it? You can really go back to those time periods and think, yeah, I remember that ball hitting the wall or whatever it is.
Yeah.
But no, that's been brilliant. Is there anything else that I've not asked you? We've covered a lot of things there, but is there anything else you want to add?
No, we've been on there a long time. I'm sorry. Yeah.
No, it's great. I've really enjoyed it. It's been really good. So yeah, interesting. I just understanding how it all developed, and again, having a personal affinity to sports therapy. You know, I've been wanting to ask you a while for how that originated. But you know, brilliant. I really appreciate your time on it, and yeah, I hope you managed to get out and about in Glasgow with the busy traffic, and yeah, hopefully we can catch up in person again soon. So
I hope so. Yeah, that'd be good. Yeah, Andy, thanks very much. And as I say, thanks for the invite, and yeah, we'll see you soon.
Keep in touch. Brilliant. Thanks, Graham.
Cheers, Andy. Okay, bye-bye for now.